Things have become an absolute disaster in Happy Valley, and this feels like the nail in the coffin for James Franklin and the Penn State Nittany Lions. What a disaster of a season so far for this team to be the preseason #2 ranked team in the country. They had championship aspirations, so much returning talent on the offensive side of the ball, including one of the top quarterbacks in the nation in Drew Aller, who a lot of people said if he went in the draft last year would have gone #2 overall to the Cleveland Browns. And of course, you have that dynamic backfield of running backs, that 1-2 punch with Katron Allen and Nick Singleton. So much offensive firepower returning for Penn State. And the thing for this team over the last few years, it's been, hey, we're going to have a great defense. That's going to keep us in virtually every single game. It's going to keep us close in these top 10 matchups. And we'll talk about the top 10 matchups very shortly here. But it's going to keep us close in those games. But the offense is ultimately going to let us down in the end. And you felt like this was the year where the offense was going to win them football games, and it has just been a disaster to say the least. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Caden Kubler, and thank you guys so much for tuning in. I don't know how you have any hope if you are the Penn State Nittany Lions, and quite frankly, I don't know how you move forward with James Franklin. I'm not going to sit here and say I think he should get fired, but I think at a certain point, I don't know how you keep a coach around if something like this continues to happen, because you see it in the NFL all the time, and you see it in college football too. Sometimes with great coaches that have been at places for a long time, when you had a lot of success earlier on and you go on a dry streak, sometimes your voice in the locker room runs thin. And we've seen this before. And I think we may see this with Dabo Swinney and the Clemson Tigers this year. Sometimes your voice runs thin in a locker room. And I think that's what we're seeing ultimately with James Franklin. This has now been a continuous cycle with Penn State. They've never been able to beat the elite football teams. They've never been able to beat the top 10 teams, the top 5 teams, and they've never been able to get over the hump. Now, they've been able to beat the mediocre teams. They've been able to beat the ranked teams. And it's so funny because this Penn State team reminds me a lot of what Ohio State was last year with Ryan Day. Now, obviously, the sample size and the tenure of James Franklin is a lot longer than what it was with Ryan Day when he took over for Urban Meyer. But for Ohio State, it was like, okay, they could never beat Michigan. They could never win the big game, and they could never win the championship. And you have that disappointing loss to Michigan at the end of your season, and everyone's counting you out, but you still get into the college football playoff. You still get hot and you win a national championship. And Ryan Day gets that monkey off his back, because ultimately everybody said that he should be fired after he lost to Michigan for a 4th year in a row. And I believe that's what we're seeing with James Franklin right now. At the end of the day, Penn State was the #2 ranked team in the country coming into this year. They had championship aspirations. They start the season 3-0. They play at absolute cupcakes. But then this was the test where we get to see if Penn State, if this was the same old Nittany Lions team of the past, or if they could finally beat a top 10 opponent. They had a whiteout. They were at home, one of the best atmospheres in college football. They were a favorite, 3.5-point favorite against Oregon. Oregon 6th in the country, coming into Happy Valley to take on Penn State. And Penn State drops the ball. They looked completely lethargic through the first 3.5 quarters of the game. They stormed back really late in the 4th quarter to force it to overtime, but Dante Moore made more big plays than Drew Aller made, and Oregon ultimately wins it. But at the end of the day, there's grumblings, everyone's upset, and yes, James Franklin's record against top 10 teams goes from 4-20 to 4-21, and we're still staring down the barrel of his record against top 5 teams as 1-18. So his record moves now to 4-21 against top 10 teams, but you're like, okay, this team is still 3-1, 10-2 is very attainable when you look at the rest of the schedule. We should be able to make it into the college football playoff, and maybe this was the loss that we needed to do what ultimately Ohio State did last year. When they lost to Michigan, they turned that into fuel, and they went scorched earth on the college football world and won the whole thing. Maybe we can do the same exact thing. That was the narrative, and that was what people were saying for Penn State when they lost this game to Oregon. Oh, so surely they'll beat UCLA, a team that has no wins, that had trailed for 0 minutes through the first 4 weeks of the season, who has a guy that is like in his 20s, basically, that is calling plays. And James Franklin loses this game to UCLA to quite literally put the nail in the coffin. This team is now 3-2. They've plummeted out of the top 25. They're now 0-2 in the Big Ten. And I'm sitting here scratching my head saying, man, I don't know how you do this. I don't know how this is a continuous theme with Penn State every single year, where they can never win the big games, where they can never get over the hump and really get on a run and win a national championship. And with what we've seen inside of the Big Ten, with Michigan winning the championship 2 years ago, with Ohio State winning the championship this past season, you felt like the stars were aligning for Penn State to really pull this three-peat off for the Big Ten, but to ultimately dominate the Big Ten this year, because Michigan is not what they used to be. They're in kind of a rebuilding phase right now with Sharon Moore, a lot of young talent. The same thing with Ohio State. This is not the same Ohio State team of last year that had all of these seniors, that had all of this returning talent. They've got a new quarterback in there, and Julian Sayin. This is a really new defense now. You've got Matt Patricia as the defensive coordinator. This is not the same Ohio State buzzsaw that they were last year. Now, I understand they're the number one team in the nation, and they are a great football team, but Penn State had way higher expectations, and they should have been the cream of the crop when it came to the Big Ten. And I also view the same thing for Oregon right now. They're kind of going through a rebuilding phase as well. They lost a ton of pieces, but yet if there's one thing that's consistent, you look at the great coaches, the Ryan Days, the Dan Lannings, the Sharon Moores, they have their teams ready to go. And Sharon's definitely not as proven as the other guys, but you look at Dan Lanning and you look at Ryan Day, they have their teams ready to go, and they're going to make college football runs, and nobody would be surprised right now if they won the national championship. For Penn State, this was supposed to be the year you drop the ball big time, and I don't know how you realistically bounce back from this, because you look at the rest of the schedule, you could beat everybody that is not ranked. You know, you've got Northwestern at home, you've got Iowa on the road, you got Michigan State on the road, you've got Nebraska at home, and Rutgers on the road. Okay, boom, there's 5 wins right now, assuming they don't drop the ball again. That's cool. You're 8-2. You've got to beat Indiana at home, which I think they can win, because I don't think Indiana is as good as Ohio State. Then you've got to go on the road and beat Ohio State. They have no room for error. A team with 9 wins has never made it into the college football playoff. And as of right now, where we stand, Penn State already has those 2 losses, and they've got to beat Ohio State on the road, and they've got to beat Indiana at home, and then they've got to take care of business against every other opponent inside of the Big Ten if they want to have a chance to make it into the college football playoff. Nothing would even be guaranteed. I would think if they get 10 wins, they'd make it. But do we really think right now that Penn State is going to run the table with what they've shown over the last 2 weeks and make it into the college football playoff? I don't personally see it. And that's why I think everybody is calling for James Franklin to be fired. The stats are really tough. The top 10 teams, the top 5 teams, those are tough, but you still felt like, okay, if you take care of the rest of the cupcakes on the schedule, you still can make it into the college football playoff, and you can't ultimately be too upset about that. But then you lose to UCLA. Now it seems like we're going backwards, and yet you had so much returning talent. I don't know ultimately how he survives this. This seems like the nail in the coffin, but I'm curious to see how Penn State responds. I'll be quite honest. I'll put my hand up right now and say it. I picked Penn State to win the national championship this year. I have been extremely disappointed watching this team. They are not what I thought they'd be at all. This offense is not what it should have been. They show no explosivity through the air. The running game is really about the only thing that you can really hang your hat on. And I've just been extremely disappointed in Penn State. So we'll see how they respond. But ultimately their season's going to come down to if they can go on the road and beat Ohio State. If they can do that, things will start to clear up a little bit, but then we'll have a different conversation. We'll see what happens with the Penn State Nittany Lions the rest of the season. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys so much for tuning in. My name is Caden Kubler, and we'll see you guys later.